Hey guys, GhostSign here again. So today we're going to work on completing the square. Now, I want to start off by saying completing the square is one of my favorite methods. However, it is a bit longer and a lot of what we do could technically be done with quadratic formula, but the questions for the regions, they do ask specific questions where you have to use this method. So today we're going to start with the solving the nucleanda. We have 2x squared plus 11x equals 6. Now, I'm going to use the quadratic formula for this method. So the quadratic formula is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Alright, so in order to use the quadratic formula, we have to identify a, b, and c. And in order to do that, we need it in standard form. We need it in ax squared. So that means x squared comes first, plus bx. That means x comes second, plus c, the constant by itself. And it has to be equal to 0. So as of right now, it's not equal to 0. I need to get rid of this 6. I'm going to subtract 6 on both sides and subtract 6 here. Ooh, that's a bad line. Let's try that again. Better. Alright, so that I'm left with 0 equals, and on the left side I'm left with 2x squared plus 11x minus 6. It's at this point where we can identify a, b, and c. 2 is our a value, 11 is our b value, and negative 6 is our c value. So now that we have these values, we're going to plug it into the quadratic formula. We have x equals negative 11 plus or minus the square roots of 11 squared minus 4. A is 2. C is negative 6. Remember, we want to keep the sign with the number. So since it's a negative 6, I'm going to write negative 6 inside here. And then all over 2a. 2 times 2. Alright, now there's 3 different parts here. There are 3 parts that we can type into the calculator. Now, a couple of these are actually easy to solve without a calculator. So I'm going to do that. We have x equals negative times 11 is just negative 11. I bring my plus or minus, and I bring the square root sign. And this is all over 4. Now everything inside the radical we can actually type into the calculator. If you want to do mental math, go for it. But I'm going to type this into the calculator. So I'm going to type it in exactly how I see without the square roots. So I'll have parentheses, 11 squared minus 4 times 2 times negative 6. I don't know if you can hear in the background, but my little Daisy there is making noise. She wants to teach as well. Alright, so we get 169. And I'm going to write that in here. Now 169, that's a pretty big number. First thing that we should always do is check to see if this number is a perfect square. Okay? In order to do that, we're going to press second square root and 169. If it's a perfect square, we're going to simplify it. If not, we're going to, well, if it's a perfect square, we're going to write the actual number. And if not, we're going to see if we can simplify it. So in this case, square root of 169 is a perfect square. It's equal to 13. So let me get more space here. That means we're going to have x equals negative 11 plus or minus 13 over 4. Now remember, because we have plus or minus, this means that we have 2 answers. And because every one of these are whole numbers, we can get a final answer. I'm going to split this up. You have negative 11 plus 13 over 4, and negative 11 minus 13 over 4. Negative 11 plus 13 is 2. 2 divided by 4 is just 2 over 4, which simplifies down to 1/2. And negative 11 minus 13. Now, I'm not too good with negative numbers, so I'm going to type it in just to be sure. So I have negative 11 minus 13. And we get negative 24. Then we're going to divide that by 4. And we get negative 6. So we have x equals 1/2 and x equals negative 6. And these are my two answers. Now, one way we can also check to see if that's the right answer, we can type in this equation into the calculator and see if these x-intercepts are pretty close to what we got. So I'm going to go here, I'm going to type in 2x squared plus 11x minus 6. And when I press graph, as you can see, the first intersection point is at negative 6. The second intersection point is at 1/2. So we're good. Alright, let's move on with today's lesson. So again, quadratic equation is an equation that contains x squared. And we've learned how to factor in order to solve equations, square rooting, and quadratic formula. Today, we're going to work with completing the square. Now, completing the square, it's essentially where you have to make something into a square. So we have this equation, which is a trinomial, and we turn it into something like this, where we have x minus 3 squared equals 16. We're going to go back to the square rooting method using completing the square. It'll make much more sense when we go through it. This is also known as vertex form. This is very important. Okay? Sometimes they can write this equation in vertex form. It just means that you have to use completing the square. Okay, so here's our first problem. Now we're going to follow all of these steps. There are 6 steps. We're going to follow them step by step. So I'll start off by rewriting this equation. We have x squared plus 8x plus 12 equals 0. So my first step says move the constant to the right side. Remember, constant, that's just a number by itself, or our c value. Okay? So we're going to take our c value, which is 12, and move it over to the left side, the right side. I subtract 12, subtract 12. I'm going to rewrite this. I have x squared plus 8x equals negative 12. Now notice I left this big space here for a reason. We're going to have to add something to both sides of this equation here. So when you're solving this problem, I want you to leave this space on both sides. Okay? Now the second step is very, very important. It says take half of the b term and square it. So my b term for this problem is 8. We're finding this special number, so I'm going to do this off to the side here. Oh yeah, perfect. So we have 8 divided by 2, because we're going to take half of our b term, which is 4, and then we're going to square this b term. Square, which is 16. Okay. Now I'm going to underline this here, and I'm going to say that this is kind of important. You're going to see why in a moment. So I showed all of my steps here. 8 divided by 2, which is 4. 4 squared, which is 16. Take half of the b term and square it. Now the third step says that we're going to add that number to the both sides of the equation. So I'm going to take that new number, which is 16, I'm going to add that to both sides. I'm going to add it to the left side. That's why I left the space there. And to the right side. Okay. Now, we have this type of equation. It says, for step 4, to factor the left side of the equation. So when we factor this, we're going to use trinomial method. This method will always work, and inside the parentheses, something interesting is going to happen. So I need to figure out two things that adds to 8, multiplies to 16. I split my x and x. And I got to figure out what multiplies to 16 and adds to 8. Well, we know that's going to be 4 and 4. Right? I drop my plus sign. Positive times positive gives me positive. And 4 times 4 is 16. 4 plus 4 is 8. Now, you know you're doing this method right when both of these parentheses are exactly the same. They need to be the same in order for us to continue with this method. If they're not the same, you probably did something wrong. Now, I'm going to simplify this here. I have negative 12 plus 16. That just gives me 4. Alright. Now, I did part of step 4. It said factor the left side. But it also says to write it as a perfect square. What that means is that whenever we have two parentheses that are exactly the same, I can just rewrite them as x plus 4 and then a squared on top. Now this is why we call it completing the square. We turned it into a square and then equals 4. It's at this step here where we can simplify everything based off of the method that we did before, the square rooting method. So let's do that. Since I have a square, I'm going to take the square root of both sides. Square roots and square roots. Alright, so the square and the square root cancels. I'm left with x plus 4 equals. Now remember, I'm taking the square root here, so I need plus or minus the square roots of 4. Now we can simplify this down, but let's just continue with this method. We're going to subtract 4 on both sides. That goes away. I'm left with x equals negative 4 plus or minus the square root of 4. Now we all know the square root of 4 is 2. So I can rewrite this as x equals negative 4 plus or minus 2. And since we have whole numbers, we can split that up. We have 4 minus 2. Oops. Negative 4 minus 2. Let me do that. Negative 4 minus 2. And negative 4 plus 2. Now notice I did something a little different. Did I do this wrong by putting the minus first and then the plus afterwards? Nah, it doesn't matter. You're going to get the same answer no matter what. So negative 4 minus 2, which is negative 6. And negative 4 plus 2, which is negative 2. Here are our two answers. Okay, so let's recap. Let me scroll back up. So the first thing I did, oops, come on. All right. So the first thing I did was I moved the constant to the right side. So I took this 12, moved it over, took half of the b term and squared it. This is a very important step. My b term is 8. I took half of that, squared it, and I got 16. Third step is that we add that to both sides of the equation. So 16 here, 16 there. And then I factor the left side and rewrite it as a perfect square. So I have x plus 4, and then I rewrite it with a square. And then I just solved. So now I did say a couple of things. First thing was that this 4 here, as you can see, that's very important. Where else do we see this 4 end up? It's right inside here. That'll always work. That's a little trick that you can use. That's why I wrote everything out. On the left side, when I have to factor, instead of me thinking, what multiplies to 16 adds to 8, I know that that number will always be 4 because I got that inside of this step here. So I can just rewrite that using this trick. Now notice 16 still has to be on this side here, so make sure you write this number on the right side. Now how do I know that this actually works? I'm looking at this. Couldn't we use trinomial for this? Absolutely. But if the directions say use completing the square, you have to use completing the square. But if we were to use trinomial, let's just see what would happen. I have x squared plus 8x plus 12 equals 0. So with trinomial, I'm going to write two parentheses. X goes here, x goes here. And I need to figure out two numbers that multiplies to 12, adds to 8. I'm going to drop my sign. This is a plus. Positive times positive is positive. Now I know that 6 times 2 gives me 12, and 6 plus 2 gives me 8. So 6 and 2. And remember, this is equal to 0, so we need to solve this further. Make your t-chart. We have x plus 6 equals 0. When you subtract 6, we get x equals negative 6. And we have x plus 2 equals 0. Oops. And when you subtract 2 on both sides, we get x equals negative 2. As you can see, we got the exact same answers as before. Same exact answers, but we need to make sure that if they ask us to use a completing the square, we use this method here. I just did this to check to make sure that it works, and it does work. But since this is not what they asked, goodbye. Alright, let's move on to another problem. So let's follow these steps exactly like we said before. First step is that we need to move the constants to the right side. Now this one's set equal to 4. That doesn't matter. I don't care what it's equal to right now because I need to move this constant over to the right side. First thing I'm going to do is add 10. So plus 10 plus 10. I'm left with x squared plus 4x equals 4 plus 10, 14. Notice I left my space here. I know I need to add something to that. So I'm going to put a plus and a blank, plus, and then a blank. Because I have to add something to both sides. Okay, now to find that special number. I take my b term, which is 4, divided by 2, which gives me 2. And then I take this 2, and I square it, which gives me 4. So I know now that on both sides, I'm going to add 4. 4, 4. Now remember, I did say that we could use that trick. Let's try and see if that trick works here. Instead of actually trying to factor, I'm going to write out both parentheses, and I'm going to write x, and this number here, I'm going to write that down inside here. So since it's positive, it's plus 2, plus 2. Now let's just make sure that this works. 2 times 2 gives me 4, that's good. 2 plus 2 gives me 4, so I'm good. It's all good. And then on the right side, I combine this. 14 plus 4 is 18. Okay? Now the next step is that I'm going to rewrite this right side here, the left side here. So I have x plus 2 squared equals 18. And you guys know what to do from here. We're going to square root both sides and solve for x. So square root, we get x plus 2 equals plus or minus the square root of 18. And then to get x by itself, we subtract 2. We're left with x equals negative 2 plus or minus radical 18. Alright, and here's our answer. Now, if you looked at this question and you got this answer, and you look for it for the multiple choice, you won't see this as an answer. Are we actually done? That's why I put a question mark there. We need to make sure that whenever we solve these types of equations, that the radical is fully simplified. In this case, 18 could be simplified further. Alright? Now I know that 18 can be simplified. I'm going to write it over here. So radical 18 could be broken up into 9 times 2. And remember, if you didn't know that, use a calculator and figure out the factors of 18. But I know that 9 can go into 18. I know 3 and 6 can also go into 18. However, 9 is a perfect square. 3 and 6 aren't. I want to get the perfect square, the biggest perfect square that goes into this number, so I can simplify. The square root of 9 is 3. Radical 2 stays as radical 2. So I can rewrite my answer as x equals negative 2 plus or minus 3 radical 2. Now, because we have one whole number, but this one here has a radical, we can't simplify any further. So this here is my answer. Okay? Now I know this is correct. Okay, let's try another one. So at this point, you should try and pause the video so you can work on this one on your own. I'm going to get started here. So first step, move our constant to the right side. I'm left with x squared minus 12x. Leave that space because we're going to add something there, equals negative 23. Then I got to find that number, that special number. I'm going to take my b term, which is negative 12. Now make sure you keep the sign with it. Negative 12. I divided by 2, which gives me negative 6. And negative 6 squared, well, let's see what that gives me in the calculator. Negative 6 squared gives me negative 36. Now that's not exactly right, and some of you guys might have been yelling at me through your screen. We need to use parentheses here, okay? As you can see, when I use parentheses, I get a different answer. So negative 6 squared, I get positive 36. Alright, this is what it should be. If you got a negative number when you squared, you probably forgot your parentheses. Make sure to include parentheses. So it equals 36. So I'm going to add this number to both sides. Plus 36, plus 36. Now I'm going to use that trick. I have a negative 6 over here. And as you can see, I can skip another step. I know that my final answer has to look something like this here. I need to have a parentheses, my variable inside here, some number, and then squared. All I have to do is rewrite this part and put negative 6 inside here. Easy every time. And on the right side, I'm left with negative 23 plus 36. So let's check and see what that is. Negative 23 plus 36. And I get 13. So I'm going to write that in, 13. And then we're just going to solve for x. To get rid of the square root, square root. We have x minus 6 equals square root of 13. And don't forget, plus and minus. And then I add 6 to both sides. Plus 6, plus 6. We get x equals 6 plus or minus the square root of 13. And we are done. Alright, as you guys know, we have some problems for you to work on. Work on these 3 problems here. Now this is a 2-day lesson, so I'm going to continue with the lesson since it's the same exact stuff that we've been doing. So I'm going to move on. So we have another do now here. This one we would have to use the quadratic formula again. So go ahead and use the quadratic formula. I'll leave you guys to it for that one. So again, we're going to continue with completing the square. Okay. First step, move the constant to the right side. Add 4. We're left with x squared plus 3x equals 4. Again, I left that space there because I have to add something to it. Let's find that special number. Take my b term, which is 3. I divide it by 2. Wait, what's going on there? It's okay that you have something like this. It might be a little weird, but it'll still work. We need to still follow the steps and trust in the method. Okay, so let me get rid of that question mark. Let's see what happens. So 3 divided by 2. 3 divided by 2 is 1.5. I'm going to leave this as a decimal. If you don't believe me, let's just type it in. 3 divided by 2. That's 1.5. Now I'm going to take that 1.5 and I'm going to square that. Square. At 1.5 squared, that's just going to give us 2.25. Okay, it's okay that it's a decimal. We're still going to work with that. 2.25 is going to be our answer. So we're going to add that to both sides here. Plus 2.25. And over here, plus 2.25. Okay. Now this is where our trick comes in very, very handy. This 1.5, as I've said before, is very, very important. I can skip 2 steps by doing this here. I wrote my parentheses and my squared, so I'm going to fill this in with x, and at 1.5, it's going to go right inside here, plus 1.5. I don't have to worry about what multiplies to 2.25 and adds to 3. Nope, I already got it here. And then on the right side, I have 4 plus 2.25, which is 6.25. Nice. And then we just solve. Now we take the square root of both sides. We're left with x plus 1.5 equals, plus or minus, the square roots of 6.25. Alright, here's an interesting thing. We haven't really seen square roots with decimals. And there are some decimals that are perfect squares. Okay? All we have to do is just check with our calculator to make sure that it is a perfect square. So in our calculator, I'm going to type in second square roots of 6.25. When I press enter, as you can see, this doesn't go on forever and ever and ever. It stops at 2.5. So later on, we're going to use this number instead of the square root of 6.25. But for now, I'm going to continue the process. I subtract 1.5, subtract 1.5. X equals negative 1.5 plus or minus. Now instead of the square root of 6.25, I'm going to write 2.5. Now we have numbers here. We don't have any radicals, so we can simplify this further. Let's simplify this further. We have x equals, and the first one we have is negative 1.5 plus 2.5. And we also have x equals negative 1.5 minus 2.5. Okay. Now when we get that, we have x equals negative 1.5 plus 2.5. I believe that's 1. Let's check. Negative 1.5 plus 2.5. It is 1. And then over here we have x equals negative 1.5 minus 2.5. I believe that should give us negative 4. Let's see. Negative 1.5 minus 2.5. And it is negative 4. So we have 2 answers right here. Okay? It's okay that we have decimals. Decimals are numbers too. we just follow the steps accordingly. And this trick that I used over here helps us out a lot more. So we don't have to figure out what multiplies to 2.25 and adds to 3. Okay. Now, here's a question that you can see on the regions. It says, when solving this equation by completing the square, which equation is a step in the process? Now notice, for all of these here, they didn't continue and get an answer. They just stopped here. They want to make sure that you know how to use completing the square. If you try to use the quadratic formula or any other method, you would not be able to get this type of answer. You have to use completing the square. So let's use completing the square. We have x squared minus 8x minus 7 equals 0. Okay. First step here, we're going to add 7 to both sides. We're left with x squared minus 8x, remember, leave your space, equals 7. And now we're going to find that special number. I'm going to do that over here. So we take our b term, which is negative 8, divided by 2, which is negative 4. Now I'm going to underline that because remember, that's our special number. And we could kind of eliminate some answers just because of that right now. But let's continue. We have negative 4 squared. Remember, since it's negative, we're going to put this in parentheses, squared. Negative 4 squared is positive 16. So I add 16 to both sides. Plus 16, plus 16. And again, I'm going to skip ahead. I'm going to write my parentheses with a square and my equals. I'm going to use that trick again. Write my x, and this number here, negative 4, it's going to go right inside here. Now I know for sure I can eliminate 2 answers. I can eliminate C and D. We don't need that 8. It needs to be 4. Alright, and then on the right side I have 7 plus 16. 7 plus 16 is 23. And now I definitely have my answer. We have B. Now, if you screwed this up and you forgot to use the parentheses, you might have gotten 9 or something, maybe. Or if you messed up this sign here, since you're supposed to add 7 on both sides, let's say you subtracted 7 and you left this as a negative. 16 plus negative 7 does give you 9. So you got to be sure that you're doing this part correct. Anyway, I don't have to go any further because I found my answer. There's my answer. Alright, and let's try this one. So again, pause the video so you can try it on your own. And then you can check your answer with me afterwards. So I'm going to rewrite this. I have x squared plus 6x minus 7 equals 0. So again, first step, move my constant over. Add 7 to both sides. Now, some of you guys, if you look at this equation, you can probably eliminate 2 answers right now, which is pretty cool. I have x squared plus 6x equals 7. Gotta find that special number, so I have 6 divided by 2, which equals 3. Very important. So from here, I'm going to eliminate 2 answers. I know it can't be negative. I'm going to cross those out. And then we have 3 squared, which is equal to 9. Alright, I'm going to add that number to both sides. Now again, I know that when I add 7 and 9, it's not going to be 2. I know my answer is going to be D. Well, let's just simplify this down a bit. We have my trick. So we have x, we have this 3. It's going to go inside here. Squared equals, and then 7 plus 9 is indeed 16. That's my answer, and that's choice D. Alright, so I believe those are the last questions. Here are some more group practice problems. So in total, you have 6 problems to work on. Please work on those, and once you're done, take a picture of it, upload it to Google Classroom so we can give you credit for it. Alright, bye for now.